Hello children, I am Sunil Kumar Pandey, your English teacher from Cambridge International School, Tasua. In this video, we will discuss the remaining part of chapter 7 of your textbook Flamingo, the interview by Christopher Sylvester. In the previous video, we had almost finished part 1. We stopped at the point where Saul Bellow described his experience of interviews as thumbprints on his windpipe. We discussed the meaning of this phrase in detail. Now, the last few lines re-emphasize the importance of interviews in present-day journalism. So, we are towards the end of page number 69. Yet, despite the drawbacks of the interview, it is a supremely serviceable medium of communication, supremely of the first order, serviceable, practical, easily carried out. These days, more than at any other time, our most vivid impressions of our contemporaries, vivid, lively impressions, images, and contemporaries, those who are living at the same time as we are. That means present day celebrities and other famous people are through interviews. Dennis Bryan has written, almost everything of moment reaches us through one man asking questions of another. Moment means importance. Because of this, the interviewer holds a position of unprecedented power and influence. Unprecedented, which has not been the case earlier. Unmatched, unparalleled power and influence. So in these few lines, the writer emphasized that whatever merits or demerits of the interview, one thing is certain, that this is a very, very practical form of journalistic communication. Today, our most lively images of our contemporary celebrities are through interviews, whether printed or telecast on the electronic media, and almost all important news reaches us through the medium of interviews. You may wonder, how is this so? We often read news reports, we don't read interviews, but how do those news reports come to us? When the journalists involved, the correspondents involved, ask questions. They may ask questions from government officials, from officials of other organizations, or from eyewitnesses of something. So, whether explicitly or in the background, it is actually interview which conveys almost all important news to us today. Now we come to part 2 of this chapter, which is an excerpt from an actual interview. It begins with a quote of the interviewee, Umberto Eco. I am a professor who writes novels on Sundays. This quote will occur later on in the excerpt, and we will discuss it then. In the beginning, an introduction has been given of both the interviewee and the interviewer. So let's read about them. The interviewer, this is an interview of Umberto Eco. The interviewer is Mukund Padmanabhan from The Hindu, and Umberto Eco is a professor at the University of Bologna in Italy. When this interview took place, by that time he had already acquired a formidable reputation, a very serious reputation as a scholar for his ideas on semiotics. Semiotics means the study of signs. signs, SIGN signs, and these signs are wide ranging. I may point it out to you that all our languages are based on signs, written signs as well as spoken signs. So, semiotics or the study of signs also involves the study of languages. So, Professor Umberto Eco is a professor of semiotics or the study of signs or languages. Apart from that, he is also a scholar on literary interpretation and medieval aesthetics. And he had already acquired a formidable reputation in all these areas before he turned to writing fiction. At a later date, he also became a novel writer. Literary fiction, academic texts, essays, children's books, newspaper articles, his written output is staggeringly large, astonishingly large, and wide-ranging. In 1980, he acquired the equivalent of intellectual superstardom with the publication of The Name of the Rose, which sold more than 10 million copies. This was a novel which was published in 1980 and became an all-time bestseller. As we just read, this sold more than 10 million copies and brought him to the stage of literary superstars. So, this excerpt illustrates the art of interviews. When you read, you should notice how the interviewer confines himself to speaking the minimum amount of time and allows the interviewee to speak for the maximum amount of time. You should also note how the interviewer uses prompts, appropriate prompts that would motivate, that would exalt the interviewee to speak more on his ideas. So let's just read this first question of Mukund. The English novelist and academic David Lodge once remarked, "I can't understand how one man can do all the things he does." That is, Eco does. So here he has not asked any question. He has just quoted another man to provoke Eco to say something, and Eco says, "Maybe I give the impression of doing many things, but in the end I am convinced I am always doing the same thing." Eco's answer is, "From my literary output, which consists of novels, children's books, essays, academic texts, and so on, it might appear that I am into several things, but basically all those things are one." And Mukund's two-word question is, "Which is?" And this prompts Eco to say a lot in the next answer. He says, "Now that is more difficult to explain. I have some philosophical interests and I pursue them through my academic work and my novels. Even my books for children are about non-violence and peace. You see, the same bunch of ethical, philosophical interests." So, Eco's answer is that he is only concerned with one thing, and that is his philosophical ideas, which also include non-violence, peace, and all his work is meant to spread these ideas. He says further, "And then I have a secret. Did you know what will happen if you remove the empty spaces from the universe? Eliminate the empty spaces in all the atoms? The universe will become as big as my fist." You would have read this in your science lessons, that first of all, this whole universe, this huge universe which consists of billions of stars and planets and satellites, of which Earth is just one small peck, this has a lot of empty space inside it. After our atmosphere, there is just empty space, vacuum. Then all that matter which we see, our atmosphere consisting of so many gases, I, myself, this book, everything, these are made of molecules, and there is space, and these molecules are not tightly fitted against each other. There is space between these molecules. These molecules consist of atoms, and in the arrangement of atoms within a molecule, there is again space. And an atom consists of electrons, protons, and neutrons. Electrons and protons are concentrated in the nucleus, and there is again space between the nucleus and the orbits of the electrons. And maybe there is more space within this structure of electrons, protons, and neutrons as well. So the point is, the whole universe in the largest part consists of empty spaces, vacuum, and if all that empty space, the vacuum, is removed, perhaps it will become as big as our fist. Now this may be an exaggeration, a hyperbole, but this is true, that a large part of the universe consists of empty spaces. Now why is Eco talking about all this? Interesting. He says, similarly, we have a lot of empty spaces in our lives. I call them interstices. Very interesting theory. Our lives, our everyday lives, are also occupied by empty spaces when we are not doing anything in particular, when we are just whiling away our time, just lying down, perhaps just thinking something. So Eco uses the term interstices for these empty spaces, and he gives example. Say you are coming over to my place, you are in an elevator, and while you are coming up, I am waiting for you. This is an interstice, an empty space. I work, now he gives a secret, I work in empty spaces. I work in those moments of my daily life when I am not doing anything in particular. And then he gives a humorous example. While waiting for your elevator to come up from the first to the third floor, I have already written an article. This is just a joke. But his answer is, and this is really food for thought, if we use all those if we use all that of our time when we are not doing anything in particular, how much we can be able to accomplish in our lifetime? Well, this brings Mukund to his next question. Not everyone can do that, of course. But see how deftly he changes the topic. Your non-fictional writing, your scholarly work has a certain playful and personal quality about it. It is a marked departure this is considerably different from a regular academic style, which is invariably depersonalized and often dry and boring. Have you consciously adopted an informal approach, or is it something that just came naturally to you? Perhaps you are not very familiar with academic writing. Academic writings are research papers, theses, dissertations published by higher level students of MPhil, PhD, and other academics, professors, and so on. These are invariably written in a particular style. This style is impersonal and it is very, very boring. If you go through an academic paper, you will find the same things: abstract, introduction, methodologies, so many things, and all those things written in such a boring way that no one except the experts of the subject and those interested in the paper can read them. But this is not the case with Umberto Eco. according to Mukund, even his academic writing has a playful quality. It too sounds interesting. And Mukund's question is did this style come naturally to him or was it consciously cultivated? Eco's answer. Eco gives an incident from his life. When I presented my first doctoral dissertation in Italy, one of the professors said, "Scholars learn a lot of certain subject, then they make a lot of false hypotheses, assumptions. Then they correct those hypotheses, correct those assumptions, and at the end they put the conclusions." That is the usual way to write an academic paper. You, on the contrary, told the story of your research. You have not written in that way, you have given the story of your research in your paper, even including your trials and errors. You have even included those parts where you failed, where you made errors. At the same, Eco's professor recognized that this was totally different, but at the same time, he recognized I was right and went on to publish my dissertation as a book, which meant he appreciated it. So, this is what Eco tells about the evolution of his academic writing style, which is in the nature of storytelling. Now, at that point, at the age of 22, I understood scholarly books should be written the way I had done, by telling the story of the research. This is why my essays always have a narrative aspect, narrative telling a story. My essays read like a story. And this is why probably I started writing narratives, that is novels, so late, at the age of 50, more or less. So he says that he started writing novels so late in his life, probably because he did not feel the need earlier, because he was already writing sort of novels in the form of his academic papers. Then I remember that my dear friend Roland Barthes was always frustrated that he was an essayist and not a novelist. He wanted to do creative writing one day or another, but he died before he could do so. I never felt this kind of frustration. He recalls a friend who was frustrated because he could not write novels. But Eco says he never felt this kind of frustration even though he was not writing novels, because he was telling stories like novels in his academic writings. I started writing novels by accident. I had nothing to do one day, and so I started. Novels probably satisfied my taste for narration. Mukund's question. Talking about novels, from being a famous academic, you went on to becoming spectacularly famous after the publication of The Name of the Rose. You have written 5 novels against many more scholarly works of non-fiction, at least more than 20 of them. Eco says over 40. Over 40. Among them a seminal piece of work, seminal, very, very important piece of work on semiotics. But ask most people about Umberto Eco and they will say, oh, he is the novelist. Does that bother you? Mukund's question is that you have written just 5 novels. And on the contrary, you have written more than 40 academic papers, and yet you are known to most people as a novelist. So, are you disturbed at this? Eco says yes. Because I consider myself a university professor who writes novels on Sundays. That is, writing novels is not my main profession. This is just my hobby. It's not a joke. I participate in academic conferences and not meetings of pen clubs and writers. I identify myself with the academic community, not the community of fiction writers. But okay, if they, that is the most people, have read only the novels, he laughs and shrugs. I know that by writing novels, I reach a larger audience. I cannot expect to have 1 million readers with stuff on semiotics. That's true. Academic writing will obviously have a limited audience. So even though Eco identifies himself as an academic, he is happy that at least through novels he is reaching a wider audience. Then Mukund's question, which brings me to my next question. The Name of the Rose is a very serious novel. It's a detective yarn at one level, detective thread at one level, but it also goes in detail into metaphysics, sort of philosophy, theology, science of religion, and medieval history. Yet it enjoyed a huge mass audience. Were you puzzled at all by this? So Mukund's question is that, Mukund's implication is that people are supposed to like writings, novels, stories which are not very serious, which are entertaining. On the other hand, your novel was very, very serious in nature. It had so many complicated issues, and yet it became so popular. So how do you explain this? Eco's answer is no. Journalists are puzzled, and sometimes publishers. And this is because journalists and publishers believe that people like trash, useless things, and don't like difficult reading experiences. Journalists and publishers believe that people don't like serious reading experiences. I don't believe that. Consider there are 6 billion people on this planet. At that time, there were. The Name of the Rose sold between 10 and 15 million copies. So, in a way, I reached only a small percentage of readers, in spite of its huge popularity. But it's exactly these kinds of readers who don't want easy experiences. Or at least don't always want easy experiences. I myself at 9 p.m. after dinner watch television and want to see either Miami Vice or Emergency Room. I enjoy it and I need it, but not all day. This means I am a serious scholar, but after dinner at 9 p.m. I too enjoy entertaining programs on television. But this does not mean that I would like entertaining programs all my day. In the same way, people may sometimes like light, entertaining reading experiences, but it does not mean that they will always like that. They would also sometimes want serious reading experiences. So, Eco's assertion is that there are people almost all people, who at some point want serious reading experiences, and it is because of them that this novel became so popular. And the last question of Mukund: could the huge success of the novel have anything to do with the fact that it dealt with a period of medieval history so again, instead of asking a direct question, he is speculating on the reasons for popularity of the novel, and Eco elaborates. That's possible. It's possible that it became popular because of medieval history, but that cannot be the whole reason. Why? But let me tell you another story. And then he makes a humorous comment: because I often tell stories like a Chinese wise man. My American publisher said while she loved my book, she didn't expect to sell more than 3,000 copies in a country where nobody has seen a cathedral or studies Latin. But in the end, it sold 2 or 3 million in the US. So Eco's answer is medieval history is a popular subject in Europe. So it might be one of the reasons for the novel's popularity in Europe. But how do you explain its popularity in US, where people don't even know what cathedrals are, or who have not read Latin, that means who are totally ignorant of medieval history. In the US too, it became hugely popular. So there must be some other reasons. So I was given an advance, okay. A lot of books have been written about the medieval past far before mine. I think the success of the book is a mystery. He himself is not sure. Nobody can predict it. I think if I had written the name of the rose 10 years earlier or 10 years later, it wouldn't have been the same. Why it worked at that time is a mystery. So according to Eco, it might be possible that it became popular because of its subject of medieval history, but that cannot be the whole reason. And what exactly was the reason, he himself is not sure. So students, this was the very short chapter, the interview. In the next video, we will discuss its questions and some other issues related to this. Thank you.